Awesome. Thank you everyone for being here today. It's my pleasure to be presenting some of the research that I've been doing in the background today. As Hannah said, my name's Moses, and I am currently doing some research on counter-movement jump braking phase strategies in elite team sport athletes. And I know that that's a mouthful, but hopefully I can decipher some of the jargon as we go through this presentation today. So to start off with defining what a counter-movement jump is, or a CMJ for short, this is a stationary vertical jump typically performed off of 2 feet and consists of a downward phase immediately followed by an upward phase. And hopefully these videos here work. So it can be performed with an arm swing, like you've just seen now, or it can be performed with hands on hips. And the CMJ is one of the most common vertical jumping variations, not only seen in research, but utilized in sport as well, whether that be for performance-related factors or for rehabilitation-based reasons. To go into a little bit more detail on the downward and the upward phases that I referred to previously, starting with the unweighing phase, this is the initial portion of the downward phase of movement, and this is typically where forces drop below body weight. Following this transitions into the braking phase, which is going to be the central topic of this presentation. This is the final portion of the downward phase of movement, and this is typically where forces start to climb back up towards and beyond body weight, and the velocities go from negative go negative. And then the propulsive phase is the upward phase of movement, which is essentially where the velocities go from negative to positive, and this occurs right up until the flight phase where the individual leaves the ground. Now, the reason why the CMJ is so important is for a couple of reasons. One is that it underpins many sport-specific actions that contribute to match-winning outcomes. So an example includes basketball, hence why I've put Steven Adams up here. We see the CMJ commonly occurring during shot blocking actions. We also see it in finishing on the offensive end. And we can also see the CMJ throughout multiple other team sports, such as netball with shot blocking attempts as well as mid-court pass intercepts. And even in sports that don't necessarily involve jumping within live match play demands, we see very strong and verified correlations between CMJ performance and other sport-specific actions and general physiological qualities. This includes sprinting, whether that be across shorter or longer distances, change of direction ability, whether that be linear or lateral, and of course, strength and power. Now, one of the main questions that I guess I'm going to be answering today is how you actually maximize CMJ height. And there's been a lot of extensive research that's been done to sort of answer this question. And what current research has shown is that it's pretty much the propulsive phase that is the most important aspect for improving jump height. More specifically though, it is takeoff velocity. So this refers to how quickly you're moving right before you leave the ground. And this is set up effectively by producing higher relative propulsive impulses. So this is essentially the combination of force and time relative to our body mass. So the more relative propulsive impulse we can produce, the greater our takeoff velocity will be, and therefore the higher we should jump. However, what role does the braking phase play? So remembering that the braking phase is that final component of the downward phase of movement. And the reason why I raised this question is because, as Hannah just brought up before, the publication that I recently just got accepted, I essentially conducted a systematic review looking at the different biomechanical and physical characteristics that related to improvements in CMJ performance. And what became very prevalent was that braking phase measures were heavily underreported, especially when compared to propulsive phase metrics. So that's hence why I've put up 23 times that braking phase measures were referred to versus 37 times for propulsive phase measures. And even for those 23 measures that were reported, across studies there was massive disagreements or massive heterogeneity between studies and even within single studies as well. So the examples I give include braking impulse with correlations ranging between trivial and very strong in their magnitudes, And then in one study conducted by Rauch and colleagues, they found that the peak knee flexion angle that an individual achieves can have either a negative or a positive relationship, meaning that it can either enhance or make your performance worse, which is very, very confusing. And another pattern that started to emerge from this review that I conducted, which may begin to explain some of the heterogeneity that was present, was around different strategies that were used during the braking phase. So what I refer to is essentially different techniques that individuals were using during this downward portion of movement. For example, a handful of studies found that individuals may use either a hip dominant, knee dominant, or a mixed joint contribution strategy, or some individuals might use a fast, shallow braking phase strategy, meaning that they don't go as low, but they make up for this by going down very, very quickly, versus individuals that use the opposing strategy. So this means, relatively speaking, they travel down slower and they go through a larger range of motion. So the aim of my research was to firstly answer which braking phase measures were important for maximizing CMJ height, and also comparing their relative importance to propulsive phase measures that were also critical for maximizing CMJ height. And then lastly, also answering whether there were different braking phase movement strategies in existence, and if so, what their unique characteristics were. I conducted a cross-sectional study design with 51 team sport athletes across variable time points of the competitive season. This 51 team sport athlete population consisted of 31 males and 20 females, all of which were elite and well-trained. So by elite, what I'm referring to is that they either represented their team either at a regional, national, or international level. And this included individuals that participated in either basketball, field hockey, rugby, and many more team sports. The equipment that I used involved a 7-camera motion capture system alongside dual force decks to gather a wide range of biomechanical measures, ranging from temporal factors, kinetic factors, and kinematic factors. I had individuals set up with 10 different markers attached to 5 different landmarks on their body, as you can see listed by my image here. I looked at a total of 47 different measures, of which included 22 braking phase factors and 25 propulsive phase factors. Individuals were given 3 maximal attempts with 3 minutes rest between repetitions, and they were cued to jump as high as possible with arm swing. For the analysis, it was primarily quantitative, so to find out which measures were important for maximizing CMJ height, I used Pearson correlation coefficients to see which ones had the most significant correlations, and then I filtered this down to which factors were actually the best predictors of CMJ height using stepwise linear regression. To find the distinct subgroups within the population based on these different braking phase strategies that I'm alluding to, I used silhouette analysis, principal component analysis, and k-means cluster analysis to divide the groups. And then lastly, I used t-testing to see if there was a significant difference between any identified clusters in terms of the characteristics that differentiated between them. And then also I went to see if there were actually significant differences between the different groups in terms of their average jump heights. For the correlations, a total of 26 variables emerged with their p-values being less than 0.05. Out of those 26 measures, there was a total of 10 braking phase metrics which were significantly correlated with CMJ height. So you can see that these are highlighted in the black circles here. The strength of those correlations ranged between weak and moderate for the braking phase metrics, while for the propulsive phase measures, these ranged between weak and very strong. Filtering down to the best predictor model for CMJ height, this brought us down to 17 measures in total, and of those 17 measures, this included 6 braking phase metrics. That included relative braking peak power, braking peak velocity, hip flexion peak velocity and acceleration, as well as knee flexion peak velocity and time to knee flexion. With the cluster analysis, what emerged was 2 distinct groups. On the left, you'll see cluster 1, which used a stiff flexion-based strategy. And on the right, you will see cluster 2, which used a deep flexion-based strategy. Going into a little bit more detail on each of the clusters that emerged, cluster 1, which I termed as stiff flexors based off of previous literature, had higher relative braking rate of force developments. They had smaller knee flexion and hip flexion angles, and they also, as a result, had smaller counter movement depths, as you can see by the image here, where they reach the bottom of the braking phase. Cluster 2, which I did refer to as deep flexors, but you can also refer to them as hyperflexors interchangeably. They had comparatively less relative braking RFD, larger knee flexion angles, larger hip flexion angles, and larger counter movement depths. And what was really interesting was that there were no significant differences between the groups in terms of average jump height. However, you will see listed below for cluster 2 that there was a trend for these individuals to be jumping slightly higher than cluster 1. However, it is worth noting that there were significantly more males in the cluster 2 sample versus cluster 1, so this may have potentially accounted for these differences. And going into a little bit more detail around the correlations and predictors for each of the clusters, although cluster 1 and cluster 2 had the exact same counter movement jump height predictor model of takeoff peak velocity, relative propulsive mean power, and modified reactive strength index, as you can see highlighted in red, what was really fascinating to note was that cluster 2 relied on a variety of both propulsive phase and braking phase measures, as you can see here and here, whereas for cluster 1, they didn't rely on any braking phase measures in order to maximize their CMJ height and purely relied upon propulsive phase metrics. So in summary, the braking phase measures that were important for maximizing CMJ height were braking peak velocity, peak power, hip flexion velocity, and acceleration, as well as knee flexion peak velocity and time to knee flexion. However, in terms of their relative importance compared to propulsive phase measures, they play less of a role, but do still have a valuable contribution. In terms of the different braking phase movement strategies that were identified, there were 2 that emerged from the group, as I pointed out, one being stiff flexors and one being hyperflexors. However, there are potentially more out there, as during my analysis, there was a small subgroup that started to emerge which displayed characteristics along the lines of having more of a hip dominant strategy where they didn't actually flex much through their knee joint. And in terms of the unique characteristics of each of the existing strategies that I've pointed out, as I suggested previously, the stiff flexors relied purely on propulsive phase metrics, while the hyperflexors relied on a balanced contribution of both propulsive phase and braking phase measures. And there was no superior strategy based on the average jump heights, so what we can conclude from this is that both are equally as effective if you're trying to jump as high as possible. And more importantly, some of the practical implications from this research can provide practitioners with, I guess, an effective framework for making good decisions when it comes to enhancing the training outcomes for our athletes. For example, this would include understanding which propulsive phase measures to focus on within training and prioritizing these over braking phase measures, but still knowing which braking phase measures are worth putting time into and which ones are not. Also, this research can help us identify objectively what the different strategies are, and I guess the reason why that is critical is because this leads into our ability to create a more individualized, evidence-based framework to apply to our athletes if we're trying to jump high. It's all well and good being able to apply a general framework based on the group average, but at the end of the day, we are dealing with individuals. So this is where we can start to fall on the individual strategy-specific predictor models and ultimately create better outcomes for the athletes that are trying to jump higher within their sport. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Hope you all enjoyed.